This is Nailing the Apex. I'm Tim Harini. We've got rumors. We've got some drama to start the show today, and helping me break all this down is Mr. Mark Dailey from the Scuderia F1 Podcast. Mark, how are you?
I'm doing good. So we got rumors, we got drama. Do we have any beef? Is there any beef on this podcast or not yet?
not yet, buddy. Not yet. But there might be.
There might be before we're done. Okay. Okay.
So recording this on a Monday following the Grand Prix on the Sunday. I took a red eye to get back here and then jumped onto the podcast here. So, recovering, Daily, recovering. You know how it is.
The red eyes are never fun. They're never fun, are they?
Man, brutal. Absolutely brutal. Let's talk about Sergio Perez. Mm-hmm. Under threat of losing his seat for 2024 at the moment, no. But this was his home race. And I think this is one of the most passionate motorsport fan bases in the world. I mean, the place was packed daily. It was well over 120,000 Sergio Perez fans. Even the security at the hotel, airport, everyone was wearing Sergio Perez gear. It was pretty incredible to see. But, for a driver racing in your home race, loads of pressure, lots of adrenaline, loads of media obligations to build up the race, loads of interviews, PR, marketing, shaking hands, taking pictures, absolutely crowded around his hospitality. He needed 3 security guards to help get him from hospitality to his garage, and the walk was literally like 5 yards. It was packed with fans who were in the paddock just wanting to get a glimpse of Sergio Perez. Incredible. Never seen anything like that before in my life. So that right there, a ton of pressure on his shoulders. So the start of the race, I mean, Checo absolutely trying to send one, around the outside of Charles Leclerc and goes flying to the moon. He did say, though, that he was trying to grab the lead, and look, Verstappen said to us, he would have looked amazing. Like Sergio would have looked amazing if he had have pulled it off. And I think at the same time, he's got to try it. In this particular race, you needed the clean air to really have success and have a chance at victory. But there was no way that move was working, Daily. I mean, I tweeted this out during the race. Hamilton tried similar thing back in Qatar. 3-1 simply just doesn't go. Leclerc had nowhere to go, and he's a passenger at that moment. And when you take a look at all of it, Daily, what did you think when you first saw it? Like your immediate reaction?
Well, even before that, Checo went over the front wheel on Leclerc's car. Same thing. I'm just like, this is not ending well for one of them. And I thought, well, it's probably not going to be Max. He's on the inside, and it's kind of interesting when you see like the different angles. They're kind of like staggered a little bit, and no one clearly has the advantage over the other one, really. But when I was kind of like looking at it, and I had the same thing. It's just like, Checo obviously had the mentality, go hard or go home, which for him was right there. But if he pulled that off, like in turn 1, and he managed to get past Leclerc, past Max, he would have been set up nicely for that turn 2, which is 90 degrees to the right, and then turn 3 to the left, and then a right-hander turn 3. It would have been amazing. That would have been a legendary overtake if he passed both Charles and Max at turn 1. We'd be talking about that for years and years and years. So very risky with the potential of a high reward, and it just didn't work out. But I got to credit him for giving it his all. I mean, why not at this point? Championship's over. Max is he's crowned world champion again. They got the constructors wrapped up, but why not have one big shot for glory at your home race, right?
I totally agree. I mean, like, it's tough obviously for Leclerc. He's in a very difficult position. There isn't much that he can really do. He's kind of a passenger at that point. But I mean, he goes around the outside and he pulls that off. He's essentially probably would have gotten into the lead, and all of Mexico would have went bonkers. It would have been it would have been incredible, absolute scenes. It would have been an incredible story. Would have been great for his confidence. But instead, we got the ladder, crashed out, and frustrated Sergio Perez. I think, looking at his season as a whole, is that a move that I think he should try with how things are going and the narrative around him? No. should have tried to fight for the podium, right? Like, just chip away at it. It looks like his confidence is starting to come around with the car. He's done a lot of work in the simulator leading into the US Grand Prix, and he's been able to like claw back quite a bit of time to Max. I mean, I think he was a 10.5 off of Verstappen in qualifying on Saturday. And then, you know, who knows with the race? Like, we just don't know. If he got some clean air, he potentially could have won. Mm-hmm. It was there for sure. But at the same time, I think you have to think about consolidating that second in the driver's standings. You have to think about, you know, Lewis Hamilton, not far behind you, pretty good. He's second, he's third in the driver's standings. You're second. I think you have to use your head at that point. I think you have to think about the team in the sense that, you know, they are trying to score a 1-2 in the drivers' championship for the first time in the history of Red Bull Racing. Mm-hmm. That's hugely important, right? And they've mentioned it so many times that for the driver, you know, the driver's got to hear that. So the driver's probably got to, you know, the driver's got to think that, like, hey, this is really important to the team, and we have to consolidate this.
Yeah, it's interesting too, right? Because when you think about it, like, and not to suggest for any, you know, not even like a millisecond that Lewis is going to show up and his goal is to finish second in the world championship. But would that not be a massive moral victory for Mercedes and for Lewis to split the Red Bulls like that? We got like 3 races left, so I totally understand that where they're coming from. And you know, as much as I can't fault him for going for it, it's just like you really pointed out nicely that you got to like keep that big picture in perspective, because they've been dominant all year, and the fact that, you know, despite some of the difficult weekends that Sergio has had, and I feel like there's been quite a few of them now. It's like, I got to start like writing them down on a sheet of paper so I can kind of tally them up, but they still have this opportunity for, like you say, that they can have this historic 1-2 in the drivers' championship. So it's, you know, this has been a season where they've rewritten, or Max especially has written, you know, records literally every week. And this would be one that they could, would be a big W for all of them, right? Yeah.
I mean, if Lewis doesn't get disqualified in Austin, they'd probably be tied.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I was trying to do the math last night when I did our pod, and it was just like, what was it actually going to be? And so he gets like a little bit of a break, but you know, can he still rely on that? You know, moving forward, like, I mean, he has another off weekend, or Lewis has, you know, is just better on any one of these races coming up. I mean, this could change. I mean, there's still 3 races to go, and it ain't over till it's over.
Yeah, and that's got to make you think. Like, what does Red Bull do? You know, if he does lose second in the driver's standings? I mean, you know, Christian Horner is pretty adamant. He was adamant again this weekend. You know, he says the intention is for them to have Sergio, you know, drive for them in 2024. But, you know, this is a team that's been known to make split-second decisions on its driver lineups.
Yeah.
And so it you know, even though he's got a contract, I still just think in my head, like, nothing is going to help him keep his seat if he loses second in the driver standings, I think.
Yeah, well, you know, even last night on social media, like some of the wags out there were even you know, tweeting out pictures of, you know, photoshopped images of Sergio Perez in AlphaTauri overalls and Danny Ricciardo in Red Bull overalls. So I mean, people get that, and he understands that too, and I can't help but wonder too that if they hadn't sewn up the Constructors' Championship, if this thing was still open for debate, and say Ferrari was leading the Constructors, or Mercedes, or Aston Martin, or whoever, that they didn't pull the plug like they've done in the past. I mean, ask Danny Kvyat, ask Alex Albon, ask Pierre Gasly, ask, you know, any one of a half a dozen different drivers that have either, you know, been, you know, subject to that either positively or negatively. And yeah, how would you bounce back from that when you have have the best car on the grid, the best car that's been in the entire grid for the past couple of seasons, and not lock up that second position, because that was never like a question with like Mercedes, right? I mean, I know there was a debate and all the drama between Nico and Lewis, but once Nico retired and was Bottas, there was no question that unless something bizarre happened, that they were going to lock up those championships. I mean, Valtteri did what he needed to do. He won a bunch of races along the way, and he did the exact thing that they needed to do: deliver a ton of points, help them secure the championship without any drama and conflict with Lewis Hamilton. And he did the job, perfectly. I mean, how many times do you remember during the Valtteri Bottas Lewis Hamilton pairing, how many bad weekends did Valtteri have?
Not many.
Right.
There are a few.
There's a few
that stand out. I mean, I think I want to say Russia 2021, and there might have been a couple more in 2021. But outside of that, it's very few and far between. Like, that was a pretty decent driver pairing where you had your number one and your number two.
Incredibly consistent.
Yeah. And I think that brings us on to Daniel Ricciardo, who's pretty much the only driver to ever go toe-to-toe with Verstappen and be able to be on level with him, right? And P7 finish for Danny Rick on Sunday at the Mexico Grand Prix. His first points of the season. He was all over George Russell's ass at the end of this race.
That was good stuff, man.
Yeah, it was. It was great. Great from him. And, I got to sit down and talk to him. And he'll be on this show later in the week, our interview with Daniel Ricciardo, but he was a really, really good spirits, Dailey. Like, coming off of the USGP, showed me his hand. It's still kind of swollen.
Oh, really?
He had his operation, showed me the cut. Like, he's got a huge cut in his hand. So Nasty. He showed me all that, and I was asking him questions about it off the air. And he's just trying to rehab it because he still can't make a full fist. So this is kind of like what it looks like. And for those of you listening, he can't really. He's got like the claw.
He's got the little claw, the pinky finger.
Exactly. He can't make a closed fist. His pinky finger's kind of like hanging out. And that's just like strength, right? It's going to take some time for him to build that up again. But I mean, he was very optimistic coming into this weekend. And I would say at the start of that last stint, he didn't feel that good with the car, but the car and the tire started to come back to him. And I think that the battle with, Russell having with Lando Norris, I think that took quite a bit of life out of Russell's tires, that battle with Lando Norris. And so Ricciardo getting into more of a rhythm on that final stint with the car, and the tire started to come into the window. And it was a bit too late to really launch an attack, but he did try to give it a go. He was a bit disappointed with the result when we spoke with him at the end of the race, but also he was extremely happy with the result at the same time. So a little bit of a bittersweet weekend for him. I think as soon as they brought the car out of the garage in FP1, he was quick. There's still some things for him to get out of this car for him. I think he still hasn't really fully unlocked this car's potential, and I think there are big places for him for improvement on his side, but it's still nonetheless, Dailey, very impressive performance from him this weekend.
Well, considering he has such a minimal amount of time in the car this year, considering he came in halfway through the season, has a big accident, breaks his hand, misses a bunch more time to heal and recover, comes back in and almost right out of the gate does what he did in Mexico. I mean, come on, that's really, really impressive. But the other thing is too, I was thinking about it, just watching like all the media hits he's been doing lately, and just dial it back like 1 year ago, just it's like night and day. Like he just time. He's got like that aura around him, like that whatever, the essence of Danny Ricciardo, the big smile and everything. He just seems like he's in a really comfortable place. I mean, I guess to a certain extent there's no pressure for him because he's kind of it's just like where he can only go up from here, right? And I kind of get the vibe that there's a challenge there and he accepts that challenge, but I feel like he's a person that's really comfortable with where he's at the moment. And compared to how things finished up with Renault and how things kind of like ended up with McLaren. And then it just, this whole reserve driver thing at Red Bull just really needed him to, it was just what he needed, because I remember hearing Christian Horner say earlier this year that, it's like the old Daniel's coming back. We've been watching him in the sim, and, we've been helping him sort of correct some of these bad little habits he's picked up over the past several years. It's like he's come back to where he belongs and where he fits in. And most importantly, in an organization that can help him extract the best out of himself as a driver. And I think we really saw that demonstrated this weekend, because he's got no business doing that in that ATR04. He's got no business doing what he did with a hand that still isn't completely healed. So, I mean, I've got nothing but, mad respect for the guy for what he's doing, and especially for what we saw in Mexico. It's great stuff.
So why... I get this question. So, why was he so quick? So I would say from the U.S. Grand Prix, when he returned from injury to Mexico, there had been, I think, a lot of changes made for the car. I mean, and some of it stems back to Zandvoort when he broke his hand. Daniel doesn't drive the car the same way that Yuki does. So they can't use the same car setup as to what Tsunoda does. And because Austin was a sprint weekend, Ricciardo, he didn't get much like seat time, so it was tough for the team to get him up to speed, and couldn't really explore setup changes for him. And then, once we get into Mexico, it was a little more of a normal weekend. We have the 3 free practice sessions, and then straight into quali, and then you have the race. So lots of practice time. So this team spent all day Friday just working on different setups based around Ricciardo's driving style. And I think it's on, both that they worked with him on all of that, but also at the same time working with not only the mechanical setup of the car, but also the aerodynamics as well, and trying to bring all of those closer to what Daniel does. He has a very unique, driving style. He really attacks the corner. He likes good, pointy front end. So he's a bit more like in Verstappen. And this is where, I'd mentioned this on the pod when Ricciardo came back, and you could see that De Vries was struggling with the car, and then so too was Tsunoda. And then they brought the upgrade at the British Grand Prix, and there was still some struggling, but Tsunoda was starting to really get it and pull it together. I think the characteristics of this car compared to that of the McLaren is that it actually behaves. They're just lacking some downforce. It's given Ricciardo, his confidence, and given him confidence to push the car to the limit. And I think with the McLaren, he just never had that because of its tendencies on what it wanted to do. When you look at the comparison between the AlphaTauri and then also the Red Bull, I mean, they look like those two cars are starting to converge a little bit more. Like that AlphaTauri is starting to look a little bit more like that Red Bull, because, AlphaTauri is probably, they've brought the most upgrades to their car compared to anybody throughout the entire season. And I think it's more along the lines of like Max's sort of driving style is baked into, both of these cars in a way. And I think that's helping Danny Ric, because I think he has also similar driving traits to that of Verstappen's as well.
That's interesting. Now, I got a question for you now about the two AlphaTauri drivers. So Ricciardo, P7, and then Tsunoda finishes P12. And do we have now enough of a data sample with Danny Ricciardo in a race car in 2023 to say, okay, this is where these two drivers stack up against each other? Or is it sort of track dependent a little bit? And I know maybe the first one, after you replaced De Vries was kind of like, okay, you're in. Get in the car.
Yeah.
Go put some laps down and let's see where we're at, kind of thing. But we should be at that point now that we should be able to compare Yuki Tsunoda and Danny Ric head to head now, right?
Yeah, I think I got to sit down with AlphaTauri's chief race engineer, Jonathan Eddles, and he didn't say this, but it sounded like Ricciardo's kind of taking over that sort of leadership role within AlphaTauri. It was yes, we're still working with Yuki and we're trying to get him consistent and get him to feel confident within the car, where it's like, okay, we know exactly what Ricciardo kind of needs. And we're going to sort of get that setup dialed into the car for him, so we know that he's going to be at least going to be able to battle for a P10. Battle for a point or some points, as it were, with Mexico. I don't think we're going to see the same type of performance from Ricciardo for the rest of the season. Like, I don't think we're going to see him like qualify in the second row, like when we get to Brazil. I think for Mexico, and Eddles had said this, it's just that there's characteristics with this car that really worked well for them in Mexico, really favored their car. And for Ricciardo, he took advantage of it, where obviously Yuki had the penalty, right? He had the big engine change and he was starting at the back because of all of it. But, the pace was still pretty decent from Yuki. But then once he got into the race, and got into the heat of the battle, kind of got him by the moment, right? And he had that incident with Oscar Piastri, and it was kind of the end of his race, right? It's a shame at the same time, because, Yuki could have been in a spot for some points as well. And the team probably would have needed that. I think the P8 in the constructors at the moment, I honestly didn't think they were getting out of P10 for the rest of the season. I thought that's where they were going to be for forever. But I think moving forward, Daniel puts a couple more races like this together if the opportunities arise. But if he's able to score points or score a point more consistently, I mean, if you're Red Bull Racing, right, Dailey, you gotta.
It was a pairing that worked before in the past, right? Yeah. Like I can understand like why Ricciardo in 2018 decided to move on. It would have been pretty obvious. I think it's obvious to everyone that was Max's team at that point, and maybe Ricciardo still had desires on maybe being a world champion at some point. But what were realistically his options at that point? Like where could he have gone in 2018? So I mean, like Renault.
Aside from Renault, right? That was pretty much it. Like that was the only realistic option available. And
but I think
if you're Ricciardo, like you got to take that opportunity, right? I mean, you couldn't. I think for Ricciardo, like he knew that when Max got that big contract, he knew that he was going to be the number 2 driver.
Yeah, and by going to Renault, like they were going to kind of build a team around him, kind of thing. You're going to be the main focus and everything. So I totally understood it, but why he did it. But at the same time, it's like, you got to realize too that this is, a fairly large gamble that, they're going to be able to put a program together like they did in the days when Fernando won 2 world championships, like 15, almost 20 years ago now. Right. So that's a significant amount of time. But, but prior to that, I mean, Max of course was still maturing, and Ricciardo was, I would say the finished goods. But, he'd already kind of evolved to a very, very good Formula One driver. And together they were doing some good things with a car that was fundamentally a good car. And maybe the power unit at that time wasn't quite on the same level as, say, the Ferrari or obviously the Mercedes. But I mean, still, they did some good things together. And, like that's when the legend or the legend of the foot or was it the Shoei? The Shoei.
Yeah, Shoei.
That's what all that sort of came around. And then it's sort of been this slow kind of, it's not even a regression, because like a regression kind of suggests that Ricciardo was kind of going back to a previous, like maybe like a not quite as a good state as a racing driver, but he was at a pretty good place. It's like he devolved, or kind of, I don't know, he wasn't quite the same driver, and I feel now he's kind of going back to that Ricciardo from like 4 or 5 years ago, and it's kind of fun to watch.
100%. He definitely is. Like you can see it, just talking. Like I've talked to him, I don't know how many interviews I've done with him this year. I've done, I want to say 7 with him this year. So I've throughout and we're going back to like April, May. And so that's when he was that reserve driver role for both teams, and he was doing all the simulator work at the same time. And you could just see that he was starting to get a bit more life back into him at the same time. And the more I kind of look at his trajectory when he left Red Bull and how things sort of went for him at each team, the more fascinating I find it that when you come back to the Red Bull family and their particular car characteristics, you know, they run that car with rake. They still have rake in it. It's still there. I honestly feel that like it's his driving style that, you know, it does emulate a bit of, I think, what Max does. And I think you try and take that to another team or another car, and I don't think it necessarily works. And I don't think for like Daniel Ricciardo, he could really adapt enough to match what these other teams were giving him. His first year at Renault was tough. I mean, that car wasn't great, but his second year was a little bit better. But then once he makes that jump over to McLaren, those McLaren cars, I mean, they weren't like, like last year's car obviously was not the greatest, but I mean, the year before that, it was decent. Like, they had a pretty decent car.
It wasn't like the 2015 Fernando Alonso, you know, McLaren Honda. I mean, they put a significant amount of like distance between that era and like the Zach Brown McLaren era and the way that program's running now.
100%. And I think like him coming back and then, you know, working with his former race engineer when he was at Red Bull Racing, like trying to get him back to what he did so well when he was there. And I think they've done that. And I think that the car that he's in now best suits what he does. And I think like when you see what happens with Yuki, like I don't necessarily think that car is, you know, I think for Yuki, he has to work a bit harder to get the car to where he wants it than what maybe Daniel might have to do. It'll be interesting. The more this kind of plays out, the more that story will start to unravel, and we'll see it. We'll see it unfold. That's my assumption at the moment. Lewis Hamilton was absolutely incredible on Sunday. One of my drivers of the day, hands down, coming off a disqualification at the U.S. Grand Prix. Mexico, probably one of his best drives, I think, of the season, Daily. He was pretty masterful here.
Did Lewis get mad after that DQ in Austin? Because that must have been pretty upsetting. I mean, you know, to have like a good day like that and then to have it yanked away from you. And because, I mean, the season's gotten better for them, but by their own very, very high standards, it's still not great, even though you know, Lewis and the team and George, maybe not so much, but in general, I mean, things are going in the right direction. But still, I mean, this is not the Mercedes we're used to, and to get like, you know, to have a result yanked away from you like that must be frustrating and upsetting for someone, especially Lewis. Yeah,
100%. I think like, we had I was jumped in a press conference with him, but he had mentioned like he finished the race, did the media obligations, and then he was going to do like his ice tub sort of, you know, cool down. And I think like Toto came running in to tell him like, you know, it's like Lewis, like, you know, we might get disqualified, et cetera, et cetera. And I think for Hamilton at that moment, he was just like, dang, like what do we got to do here to catch a break?
Right.
He had said on Thursday that he thought that there was probably, from his knowledge, there was other cars that probably could have been disqualified as well. And I don't know like how accurate that actually is. I mean, I think the FIA does a really good job for, you know, grabbing teams that are taking things beyond the limit. I think they do a really good job of that. I think they're understaffed in some areas. I think the FIA could probably put a few more personnel in some positions to catch and maybe make decisions a little bit quicker. But I thought they honestly did a good job with monitoring what was going on with the U.S. Grand Prix. You know, that's a tough task, but I thought they did a pretty decent job. It sucks that, you know, Lewis had to lose that second place finish because, like I had said earlier, I mean, him and Checo would have been tied in the driver's standings at the end of this race, and that actually is a really fascinating story, like moving forward in a season where we haven't really had that many stories, right? Max has kind of run away with this, so is Red Bull Racing. There hasn't been much going on within the paddock in terms of storylines, so this would have been a good one. But I think what Hamilton does really well is puts things into perspective for himself that allows him to go and do his job properly. Allows him to focus when he needs to focus.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Like, and I think it's kind of like an organizational thing. Remember, what was it? Was it 2017 or 2018? I think it was 2017, and they had an absolute stinker of a weekend at Monaco. And then they they go away from Monaco, they come to Montreal a couple of weeks later, and they just they basically 24/7 went back to the factory, just completely deconstructed everything. Where are the problems? And then fix it. They come back, and I think that was the weekend that Lewis beat Senna's pole record and all that, and they were absolutely dominant again. It's just like that's always been one of the features, I think, of the for Mercedes and Lewis Hamilton. It's just like adversity seems to inspire them to be better, and I felt what I was watching, like Lewis on Saturday, or well, not just on Saturday, all weekend. I felt like he had that extra little bit of motivation after losing that P2 last weekend in Austin. I'm just like, this is the kind of fight back that I kind of gotten used to whenever they've had adversity, and I think they really needed it because they last year's car obviously wasn't great. This year's car didn't start great, but then they pivoted nicely and slowly have, been improving, not hand over fist, but incrementally. And so I could see that, I was wondering after last week, where are we going to see from Lewis and Mercedes in Mexico? And I'm just like, this is what I was expecting. I'm loving this. And hopefully he doesn't get DQ'd again for another technical infraction. Cause that would have been, I could just imagine all the F-bombs flying around the Mercedes garage after, if that ever happened, right?
Would have been bad. I think you make a good point. When Charles Leclerc takes you to the grass and you stick with it, yeah, that tells you something right there. Yeah, right. Yeah. Like that was a bold, big commitment move from Hamilton to get by Charles, especially in that high speed section of track. Man, like it was a big pass. Everybody in the media center were all just like, when that was going down, we're like, whoa! The whole place, you could hear everybody saying that, and you could hear the fans too doing the same thing in the grandstands, and you could just see that. He had a tough few days coming into Mexico. Like Friday and Saturday weren't great. Like the car didn't roll off the truck very fast. They had to really work at this thing. High fuel runs, low fuel runs, they weren't anywhere. They really struggled with it. And for Lewis to qualify where he did, starting this race in P6, like it was he wasn't totally happy when he came to us like Saturday post qualifying. Like he seemed still really frustrated and upset that they weren't qualifying where he thought they should be, but in the race the car just came to life. And I think what they ended up doing really is going more for a race setup more than like a quali setup / race setup. It was more geared towards high degradation and the heat too, with the Mexico Grand Prix, and trying to deal with the altitude and trying to get as least amount of drag coming off the car as they could. It's been fun to watch them, once they came into Austin with this upgrade, because I've said this before, Daily, I call it kind of like a Frankenstein car, because it's like they've been bolting like little pieces onto this car here and there. And somehow they've been able to catch up with Red Bull. And Max had like whatever it was, a 10 to 12 second gap over Hamilton at the line at the end of the race. Tire offset was different too, right? Max was on a fresh set of hards, and Lewis had to take the mediums because the team rolled the dice on that. They had too many laps on the hards coming out of that red flag, and so they just didn't think it was a smart idea. They thought they'd get more performance out of it, out of the mediums. And like, I think for this team and what they've done, it's pretty remarkable looking at this car. I mean, it shouldn't be where it is. that makes any sense.
Yeah, is it just me, or have the improvements that the Mercedes have made to this car kind of flown under the radar a little bit compared to like McLaren? I mean, McLaren's getting a lot of love for what they've done with the upgrades, and rightfully so. I mean, they absolutely deserve that. But I feel that Mercedes just hasn't gotten that same recognition. Maybe because at the start of the season they were so horrible, whereas Mercedes were kind of started off where they left off last year. They were just kind of like meh, you know. So you know, it was just we're kind of expecting we're going to have another meh kind of year from Mercedes, and then all of a sudden we get to Austria, and McLaren throw all these new upgrades on the car, and then it was like, ooh, was that a flash in the pan? And it wasn't, and we had all kind of excited about McLaren, but Mercedes have quietly gone about and made the changes to the car, and like you say, the radical changes to the concept, like to this car compared to what they rolled out at the beginning of the year, way back in March. You know, it's quite remarkable that it's kind of like you know, it just hasn't been maybe spoken about as much.
And then also like lap time wise in the race, I mean, when you look at the Red Bull, they are so good with having that optimal platform to really have a good race with the tires and low drag. But you know, when I was following both Verstappen and Hamilton on that final stint, you know, I was really looking at times in particular, and it wasn't like Max had like a half a tenth on Lewis, right? It was more whittled back a bit more. I would say he's probably had about 2-3 tenths maybe. And so when I look at that, I think that, you know, wow, you know, what this team essentially has a B-spec race car that they've been just slapping parts onto it here and there, and they've been able to, you know, catch up. I would say qualifying, it's a hit or miss, but the racing, it's gotten to the point where they're not too far off of Red Bull. I mean, Red Bull doesn't have a 20 to 30 second gap anymore. I mean, it's gotten whittled down. That's just the way it is. I mean, Lewis, you know, could have beaten Verstappen at the U.S. Grand Prix if there were a few more laps left. And so that's got me excited for next season. Just does. Like,
yeah, absolutely. You know, the only question that I have like about Mercedes is that they had this, what they felt was a diamond in the rough last year with the W13, and they stuck with it, and they you know, the sentiment is like, oh, we think we're so close to like uncorking this thing and really extracting its potential, and they can never quite get there. And they were one of the teams that last year especially really, you know, struggled with the porpoising thing. I mean, we all remember Lewis like literally dragging himself out of the car in Baku. And then, you know, I must admit that I was pretty surprised that they decided to, you know, just roll that design over into the W14, and then Toto basically right from the beginning saying, hey, you know, we're going to give this a shot, but we have a plan B in place if it doesn't work. And I'm just like, that's a pretty bold move that you've decided to stick with it despite all the challenges of never being able to do, like, get this car to do what you think theoretically it can do. And then, you know, they've come up, you know, like you say, they pivoted, they went to plan B mid-season and have made all these gains on it. And I can't help but ask myself, if they had pivoted during like the off season and decided to go with like the plan B and make that the focus and make that the plan A for the W14, I just kind of wonder, like, how much smaller would that gap have been to Red Bull, or would there have been a gap between them and Red Bull at all at the beginning of the season? That'll be one of the great unanswered questions that we'll never know the answer to, but it's pretty tantalizing to think about it. And, and like you say, I get excited thinking about it for next year.
Yeah, 100%. I just, part of me thinks that, are they too late? Like, is this? Yeah. Has it been too late? Can they turn this thing around for next season, or are we looking more at 2025? But then again, once you get into 2025, how big is the regulation change going to be for 2026? Yeah. And then it's like, okay, well then that means 2025 is, they're going to scrap that and then just focus on 2026 at the if the aero regulation becomes a big change, which we still don't know at this moment.
But that's the thing, right? It's like we keep thinking that like 26 is so far down the road. It's not.
It's not.
It's not in Formula One terms. It's like literally right around the corner. That 26 months or whatever it is until we hit Jan 1, 2026 is not that far away, especially for like all these, like this massive rule change and, you know, the next big step in Formula One, right?
100%. And, you know, when you really take a look at it, it depends how big that regulation change is going to be. They haven't really said anything at this moment, but it was interesting. I was speaking with Zach Brown about it in Austin, and I didn't ask him straight out, but I essentially said, you know, look, if, you know, we're getting great racing from, you know, P2 all the way down to P20, then why go and tamper with that aero regulation? Why not just focus on, you know, making that more focus on power units instead and try to freeze that aero regulation? And he agreed with me, right? Like I think he knew what I was driving at, where it's, you know, you get someone who has that Red Bull design, and then all of a sudden you get dominance, and then, you know, you don't get the same amount of fans coming out and the same amount of interaction on social media, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? Like we need the on-track entertainment to be really good, right? Yep. So I'm still curious to see what goes on with that. Nothing has really been said at this moment, and nothing is set in concrete either. So I'm fascinated to see what happens with that. Another thing I'm fascinated by is a battle between Charles Leclerc and Carlos Sainz in the driver's standings. Carlos Sainz, Carlos Sainz currently leading Charles Leclerc in the driver's standings, 183 points to 166. Look, I think both of these drivers have been extremely close to each other this season. I don't think Ferrari was expecting them to be this close on both points and performance. I think they may have thought that, you know, Charles would be the quicker driver because of Carlos's struggles last season with the regulation change, but I think we need to give Sainz some credit here. I mean, that guy has worked his ass off to get on pace and to figure out how to make this thing quick and work within a race around what he does with a race car. I mean, obviously, you know, Leclerc had the better performance on Sunday in Mexico. I think the conditions suited, you know, Charles's style a bit more. You know, not a lot of load on the car because of the high altitude. That allows it to slide around a bit more. And I don't necessarily think that favors, you know, Carlos Sainz, but I mean, you're a Ferrari guy, Dailey. What do you think about this battle between these two guys? I absolutely love it, man.
I love it too. Awesome. But you know, the thing that blows my mind is Carlos has done all this stuff and is getting like basically zero recognition for it, right? Yeah. You know, and partially I think that is because like that is his personality. Like, like, I mean, he's this super chill, relaxed guy. I mean, he's super professional. He just goes and does what he needs to do. I mean, maybe it's got to do with the way that he grew up. I mean, with his dad. I mean, it's just like I think like racing is just like baked into their DNA, and he just doesn't seem to get like super stressed. Like even on the radio, I mean, like we don't hear like Carlos getting super agitated occasionally, but not very often. He seems to be sort of kind of like soaks things up and just kind of rolls with it. But it's great, and I think that sometimes he just doesn't get the respect that he deserves. I mean, Charles, when he came in and he was racing for Sauber, and especially that first season that he had, I mean, the delta between himself and Marcus Ericsson, who already had like a number of seasons in F1 under his belt, I mean, there was a big delta between those two drivers. It was pretty obvious that right from the beginning that Charles was something special, and that he was not going to be one of these drivers that stayed with a lower echelon team like Sauber, Alfa Romeo at the time. You know, all respect, you know, given to them and where they were, but you could tell that Charles would, and he would filter up, percolate up to the where he would, you know, with one of the bigger teams. And, right off of the bat in his first season with Ferrari, I mean, we could talk about Australia that year all you want, but Charles should have passed Seb that year. Seb should have finished, what was it? Did he finish second in Australia that year?
Yeah, I think it was second.
So it should have been the other way around, but Charles, being the new guy, played like the ultimate teammate, but then we got to Bahrain, he really just let it all loose, and he should have won that race. I mean, the point is he's kind of been, and he's a little bit more expressive. He's a little bit more, I don't know, I would say more hip, but he's like Charles, I think, is a little bit more of an extrovert where Carlos is a little bit quieter. So I think people tend to focus on Charles and also, I mean, he gets kind of snippy on race radio every once in a while. I mean, he doesn't hold back if he's cranky about something or upset. He just kind of lets it fly, but it sets up a really kind of interesting battle because, like Ferrari isn't quite where they need to be. And sometimes they're doing what they need to do and then they shoot themselves in the foot through any number of things that usually only happen because Ferrari does it to themselves, through bad calls on the pit wall or bad strategy, or they have like a brutally slow pit stop or what, all these things that go wrong. But when it kind of shakes out, like on paper, Charles should be the undisputed, like, number one of the team. But Carlos, I think in all that he does is kind of like has people asking kind of questions now. Like, it's just like, well, number one is like, I never really realize that Carlos is as good as he is. And he's getting people to ask questions, which I think is cool. And it sets up this interesting dynamic because what if they come out with like an amazing car next year and Carlos starts winning races and I kind of get now like why Binotto didn't want to say, oh, Charles, he's my number one. Like maybe he kind of like realized he was ahead of the curve on this one to where slow people like myself, well, me, be the slowest one here, is finally coming to the fact that, maybe Mattia Binotto was onto something there by, not saying that Charles was the out and out number one driver, realizing, Carlos is onto something here. If he applies himself and does the right things, who knows what we have with this driver.
Yeah. I think like when he beat Leclerc in the 2021 standings when he first came into Ferrari, that was kind of like a slap in the face to everybody at that team to have them recognize that they weren't bringing in a number two driver. Mm-hmm. Like they were bringing in a driver who was going to push and demand and extract everything that he could from the things that were around him. And I think like settling for a number two position was just not in the cards for him. Was not acceptable. I think like this guy wants to be a champion, right? Like, I mean, they all do, but at the end of the day, you're going up against Charles Leclerc, who, the team, they never really came out and said it, but I mean, like they've been grooming Charles for the big ride for a long time, man. And bringing Carlos over, he's just been like, we're not doing this. Like he's like, I'm going to show that I belong here and I do deserve to be in the same conversation. I think last season hurt him a bit. Mm-hmm. It was a rough 2022 for him, like especially starting off. I think he went scoreless. I think it was like the first 3 races or something like that in 2022 or something. It was a struggle for him where Charles got off to a rocket start, right? Took the lead in the championship until Verstappen finally clawed it back. But I think coming into this season for Carlos, like the main focus was to beat Charles and to set himself up for 2024, to make it, to show everyone that like he does deserve that shot. Also, not being a number two driver, but being like 1A, 1B on the weekend, whatever it is, whoever is the quicker driver. On this weekend, it was Charles. He was the quicker driver. I think also with the car at the same time, it's an interesting car, Dailey? Like, I mean, because, I mean, over one lap, this is a very fast race car. It's faster than the Red Bull sometimes, like over one lap, but it's a tricky car to get the balance just right. And I think, well, the issue is just that they have this narrow operating window that's sort of, baked into the DNA of the race car, and it comes in and out of that operating window very, very quickly. Ferrari thinks, they understand why that is. So, I mean, that's going to help them for next season, no doubt. But for next year's car, it's that operating window, within the race that they need to work on. That's where Red Bull's, strengths are in that operating window. It's massive in the race. They don't have so much tire drag. They don't have to worry too much about overheating the tire, where the Ferrari really does. And so starting off this race, they weren't too confident in getting the win. And I mean, clearly they didn't, but I think if they can just fix those fundamental flaws that are sort of in the DNA of this car, I mean, they're going to have a quick car in their hands for next season.
Absolutely. And another thing I was thinking of too, just like another thing when it comes to Carlos Sainz, and I was just in the background, just doing a little bit of research here, Tim, was that we all know at this level, they're all hyper focused on their fitness, on their nutrition. They got performance coaches and everything. But, I'm going to put this one to you. What is the thing that Carlos has in his corner that nobody else does in the paddock right now?
I think when I look at him as a driver, I see, I don't know, it's like they're all hardworking, right? Like all these guys work really hard. I think there are some drivers who have, and they all have talent. All these drivers are talented. I think at the end of the day, sometimes what sets drivers apart is the work ethic.
Yep.
And how much work ethic they're, the levels that they're willing to go to.
Yeah. So you're kind of going in the direction that I want. You're getting like the broader gist. I'll give you do you want the hint? What I think hint, like Carlos Sainz's secret weapon is the name. His dad, Carlos Sainz Sr., right? Can you imagine that? He was World Rally Champion twice. And then I just, double checked. He finished up, runner up in the WRC 4 times in addition to everything else. Can you imagine having that, person like that in your corner? But that's your old man. That's your dad. I mean, he can, relate to Carlos in ways that, the best paid, performance coach or, sports psychologist or whatever can relate on a different level, and I just think that has to be invaluable. I mean, you just sit down with your dad and talk about this stuff. And I think that, that all just kind of leads into all the other things that you were talking about too, that, I mean, it's just what an incredible, what an incredible person to have on your team, literally. And that's also your dad. It's just wow. I mean, you can see you put all these little things together. I don't think it's an accident or a coincidence that Carlos Sainz is now where he is, because you take all those little pieces of the puzzle and then, if it's up to him to execute it. And, I'm not one of those people that says you just get lucky. I think you manufacture your own luck at some points. You do all the little things correctly, and over time, good things will happen, right?
Yeah, the two of them are extremely close too. Him and his dad are very close. And I think you're right in saying that, because at the same time, who else is going to really push you? Right. I know, my dad really pushed me, and I'm grateful for it, because it does make you better at the end of the day. Right. And so,
can you get your dad to talk to my son? Because that's what I'm trying to do to him. And I just feel like my best intentions just aren't resonating with him yet. Anyways, that's a sidebar. You carry on, please.
I think also, it's not like Carlos could go and buy a seat somewhere. Right? Yeah. It wasn't ever like that for him. He had to, really, he knew that his seat was never safe. He never had that security
anywhere.
And I think for some drivers that I was always like that. I never had a secure seat because we never had any funding. Someone with a crap ton of money, and it happened, could come and just take your seat no matter how good you are. And it's a little different now, but I still think some of those drivers who do have to go through that makes them, there's no tomorrow, right? It's just you've got it every single time you step into the car. That is it. you have got to extract everything. And I think that is maybe a part of his mentality, and that's probably why he's been so successful this season and has been able to bounce back from a tricky 2022. McLaren's Lando Norris had the PlayStation set to God mode on Sunday daily. He was absolutely awesome.
Yeah,
like Andrea Stella raving about Norris's performance. It was one of the better ones that the guy's ever seen, and he's worked with some pretty big drivers.
Yeah. I mean, as much as we're throwing accolades around to drivers like Lewis, you got to give Lando his props as well, because I mean he didn't even make it out of Q1. Where did he start? 19th or so? Well, I mean, there's all these shenanigans with people starting from the pit lane and stuff like that. But but I mean, the point was he was about as far back as you could get because of it, and to finish up where he was. And I mean, he was another one of these guys on Sunday that just had the bit between his teeth and just looked super determined from the moment the lights turned green that he was going to do something positive. And boy, did he ever have a good Sunday afternoon.
Absolute, just incredible performance from him. Lando rolled off P17. So
yeah, okay, there you go.
It's a pretty stunning drive. I mean, just that final stint to manage the tire enough, and then obviously to track down Piastri, and then to set off and get George. That very impressive drive at a track and in conditions where tire deg was extremely high. You could see it that it affected Piastri, and this is something that Oscar is working on, right? Is learning that tire deg at different tracks, and that's something that it does take. It takes a few years to really get that really dialed in. Mm-hmm. I mean, look at Lewis, right? I mean, managing the medium, it's just something that takes time. But for Lando, I thought that was a brilliant performance. That's one of his best, I think. It's up there with one of his, if not the best I've seen from him in Formula One. Maybe
maybe on par with that one in France that one year we had the hydraulic problem and still managed to bring it home in the points. Nice. And that might have been his rookie year. If it not, maybe it was his freshman year. Hadn't been in Formula One that long.
Oh, what was that? 2020? If I remember, 2019.
It might have been 19. It was several years ago, but it was just I was just okay, this guy's legit. If he can struggle around and still finish in the points with a car that's literally being, moments away from falling apart or having a complete hydraulic failure, I'm just wow, I'm seriously impressed by this.
And this is a track that they I sat down with Lando on Thursday, and he even said, look, we're going to struggle this weekend. This isn't going to be a good, he's like, this isn't going to be a good weekend for us. He was he wasn't saying that they, it wasn't going to be that bad, but what he was saying was look, we're not going to be battling for podiums this weekend. We're probably going to be battling for points, but not for podiums. But lo and behold, he gets into qualifying, and it's just an absolute disaster for him. Mm-hmm. Over, I think Andrea Stella thought he was maybe, he never really, it's kind of I'm trying to remember how Stella kind of framed it to us. It was you need to leave margin in Q1. Yeah. And so for those of you listening or watching, the kind of, how I think a lot of these drivers progress through qualifying, well, I know, is that they'd leave a lot of margin in Q1. So you're not destroying the car, but you have enough margin there. You kind of know that, okay, the limit is out here, and I'm kind of operating within 80% of that. Then you get into Q2, and then you got to push that margin a bit more. Okay, I got to bump it up to around 90%. And then once you get into Q3, that's when you're okay, I got to get to 95, 97, maybe 100% of that limit in the margin there. And you can risk it then. And for Lando, I think it just did that too early. And that's really costed him in his qualifying. He wasn't totally happy with the whole thing, but he knew what he had done. So, Aston Martin, man, it's been a challenging back half to this season for them. when Fernando Alonso gets out of the car in qualifying and comes and tells you that like he is not driving well and just doesn't have that confidence, you know something is not good down at the team, right? And I think for them and for the team, like they got a lot of work to do on that front. I thought Lance drove a really good race, Dailey. I thought
all things considered, I agree. Yeah.
I thought Lance did a really solid job this weekend. And I know you're pointing at your phone and you got to go. So I just wanted to like kind of just say like, look, like Lance was the faster driver this weekend. He did a really good job with a very difficult car. So head over to the debrief real quick, Dailey. We'll take some questions.
Sure.
From Mark Antoine Lepore. He asks, is there any chance Sergio Perez keeps his seat after what he's done in Mexico? He ruined his own race when he could have been in P3 after the first corner. Most likely could have finished P2 with the car that he's driving. What do you think? You think Sergio's going to keep his seat? I know we talked a lot about it off the top, but
I don't know. It's ask me that question 3 or 4 times a day. I'll probably give you a different answer depending on what happens. And I think that's just, you know, the nature of the beast right now. And knowing that Red Bull is so unpredictable when it comes to, you know, drivers that seem to struggle or, you know, maybe don't even struggle depending on what the situation is. I mean, they could make almost like a snap decision. So I think that if you're Sergio Perez, you're just going to be walking on a tightrope and whatever happens.
From at NL66, how did the mediums last so long versus the hard tires after the red flag? I can take this one.
Sure.
I think when it comes to the mediums lasting, I think it was mostly Lewis Hamilton's driving skill that made it last. I mean, he did explain how, you know, smooth and how much he had to really finesse the tire throughout the stint. Mm-hmm. And then obviously once Max getting that, you know, that 10 to 12 second gap over Lewis had a lot of clean air. And I think with this race, you know, clean air was very important because it does tend to help with that tire drag. And I think for Hamilton, that's how he was, one of the ways he was able to make that medium last and still have pace to set. I think he set the fastest lap on the last lap or something like that.
Yep.
And so I think that's how Lewis was able to kind of do that with the medium. From at Diana Leifer, hypothesis or hot take, Dailey, RBR realizes their next car won't suit Max's skills at all.
Oh wow, geez, that is an interesting one. Oh wow, I'd love to say that's going to happen, but as long as Adrian Newey's around there and that design team is, I just have to keep thinking that as long as he's around, they're going to design a really, really good car. I mean, the one thing that could be like a variable is like once, you know, that Honda engine disappears and they put like a Red Bull powertrains engine in the back of that car, might be a different story. But I think fundamentally it's going to be a good car. But if it isn't, boy, would that be a good talking point, because it'd be then where would they end up compared to everyone else? Mm-hmm.
From at Bagace. Sorry if I pronounced that wrong. From at Bagace. With climate change and excessive heat causing horrible conditions, Qatar being the worst so far, as well as fear of tire degradation now controlling how the race proceeds, do you think the FIA might consider reversing the season? Summers as off-season, 3-week winter break? Question mark. That's a challenging one. I mean, they've kind of got this thing baked in where they do their best to race in countries that have the better weather within the particular months that they travel to them. So it does make that a little bit challenging to turn that up. And I know, with global warming and stuff, it is becoming an issue. It's something they probably should take a closer look at, maybe visiting countries in different parts of the season. But I think that'd be a big ask for them to really shuffle things around that dramatically.
Especially when it comes to the big calendar that we have right now, when we have 20 plus races. That's what I see. It's just like, getting the races in the part of the world that they want it at the time of the year that they want it, when we're basically racing half the year as it is, which is challenging.
Dailey, thanks very much for taking the time to do this.
Always,
let everybody
man.
know what you've got going on and where they can find you.
So you can find us in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and all those good places at Scuderia F1 Podcast. Myself and Mr. Mark Hamilton, we drop a show, well, usually a couple times a week, Wednesday nights and then Sundays on race weekends and also on non-race weekends. And you can also find us on X at Scuderia F1 Pod. Great.
Thanks again for doing this, Dailey. Really appreciate it. I'm Tim Hauraney. If you want more from me, you can get me on social media at Tim Hauraney. If you want more Nailing the Apex, you can get it wherever you get your podcasts. You can also watch us on YouTube. And we will be back later this week with our sit-down interview with Daniel Ricciardo.